They called him a thief the moment they saw the horses, before a single word could leave his mouth, before the dust even had time to settle beneath their boots. 50 Apache warriors forming a silent ring around Ethan Cole as the late sun burned low across the valley, painting everything in copper and shadow. And there he stood, alone in the middle of it, reins loose in his hand. 200 horses shifting restlessly behind him like a living storm he refused to control, their flanks marked with fresh brands, their breath rising in slow clouds against the cooling air, and none of it belonged to him. Not the land, not the herd, not even the moment he had walked himself into. Yet every eye said the same thing without speaking, that a white man riding into their territory with stolen horses didn't deserve explanations. He deserved judgment, and Ethan didn't reach for his gun, didn't even move. Just stood there with the weight of a long ride pressed into his shoulders, his shirt dark, with dried sweat, and something deeper beneath it. Something earned miles back when the trail turned wrong and the men who took these horses thought no one would follow. The wind shifted and carried the scent of leather and dust, and something older, something that didn't forgive easy. And then she stepped forward, not fast, not loud, just enough for the circle to part without command. Nayeli, the chief's daughter, her eyes steady as stone and just as cold, studying him like she was measuring the distance between truth and lie, her gaze drifting past him to the herd, then back again, sharper now, and when she spoke, her voice didn't rise, didn't need to. It carried all the same. You crossed into our land with what was taken from us, and Ethan let the silence sit between them before answering, his voice low, rough from too many miles and not enough water. I brought them back, but the words didn't land the way they should have. Not here, not like this, because one of the warriors stepped closer, pointing to the ground where tracks twisted and overlapped, where signs told a story no one had finished reading, and another moved toward the horses, running a hand along a flank where a wound had been cleaned, stitched in a way no thief would bother with. And still, the circle held, tighter now, like a breath not yet released, and Nayeli's eyes narrowed just enough to catch what others missed. The way Ethan's hand stayed open, empty, the way he didn't look at the herd like something he owned, but something he was already letting go of. And somewhere behind him, one horse stamped hard against the earth, restless, alive. And Ethan didn't turn a comet, didn't claim it, just stood there in the middle of a storm that wasn't his, waiting for a truth that hadn't spoken yet. The silence did not break, it stretched, long and thin like a wire pulled too tight, and Ethan could feel every pair of eyes weighing him, not just for what he had done, but for what he was, a stranger standing where strangers were not trusted. And still he did not move, not when two warriors stepped closer, not when the circle narrowed by a single careful pace, because he had learned long ago that sudden movements only made a man look like he had something to hide, and he had nothing left to hide. Not after the last 30 miles of dust and heat and chasing shadows that refused to turn back. One of the horses let out a low breath behind him, and another followed, the sound rolling through the herd like a quiet signal, restless but not afraid. And that was the first thing that did not match the story being told about him. Because stolen horses did not stand calm behind the man who took them, Nayeli saw it, though she did not show it. Her gaze shifting again, slower this time, tracing the small details others missed. The way the lead mare leaned slightly toward Ethan as if she recognized him. The way the rope marks along their necks had been loosened, adjusted, cared for instead of tightened. And then her eyes dropped to the ground, to the tracks pressed into the dry earth, and she stepped forward without a word, crouching just enough to study them. Boot prints layered over older ones, directions crossing, splitting, returning. A story written in dust that only someone patient enough would read. And when she stood again, her voice was quieter, but sharper. You did not ride with them. It was not a question, and Ethan shook his head once, slow. No. The words settled between them, simple, without weight, but it did not end anything, because truth out here did not come from words. It came from what a man left behind, and one of the warriors had already reached the nearest horse, running his hand along the animal's side until his fingers paused at a place just behind the shoulder, where the hair had been cut away and stitched back with care, not fresh, not careless, something done hours ago with steady hands. The warrior looked back toward Nayeli, And for the first time the circle shifted not with tension, but with uncertainty, small, almost invisible, like the wind changing direction before anyone felt it. Ethan finally moved then, not toward them, but slightly to the side, giving the horses space, his hands still open, his voice low when he spoke again. They were driven hard, he said, not explaining, not asking for belief, just stating what was already written. In the dust and the marks and the quiet way the animals stood behind him. Naeli stepped closer now, close enough to see the lines at the edge of his eyes, the kind that did not come from age alone, but from long days under a sun that did not forgive. Her gaze flickered to his shirt, to the darker stains that had nothing to do with sweat, and she understood something then, not everything, but enough to make the ground beneath the moment shift. You followed them, she said, and Ethan did not answer right away. He just looked past her, out toward the horizon he had come from, as if the miles were still there, still chasing him. And then he nodded once, far enough. And that was all. No story, no names, no claim to anything more than the truth he had carried here. And for the first time, the circle did not feel like a trap. It felt like a question waiting to be answered. No one gave the order, but the ropes came anyway, slow and deliberate, as if the act itself needed to be witnessed rather than rushed. And Ethan did not resist when a length of rawhide circled his wrists, not tight, not cruel, just firm enough to say that trust had not yet been earned, the kind of restraint that carried more meaning than force ever could. And still he said nothing, because he understood something most men did not, that out here words were the weakest currency a man could offer. And so he let them take his hands while the herd shifted behind him, the sound of hooves pressing into dust like a steady heartbeat that refused to break. Naeli watched it all without moving, her expression unreadable, but her eyes missed nothing. Not the way Ethan's shoulders remained loose instead of tense, not the way he kept his weight balanced as if ready to walk rather than fight, and certainly not the way the horses stayed close to him even as others approached, a detail that began to unsettle the quiet certainty of the warriors around her. One of them stepped forward holding a broken length of rope, the fibers frayed in a way that told its own story, cut, not snapped, and he held it up for Naeli to see, then pointed toward the herd where several horses bore the same marks along their necks, not from being driven, but from being freed. The air shifted again, subtle, like the moment before rain when the earth seems to hold its breath. Ethan finally spoke then, his voice low, steady. They were tied in a canyon about 15 miles west of here, he said, not looking at anyone in particular, just letting the words fall where they would. Driven hard, no water left in them. And he paused, not for effect, but because memory had a way of slowing a man down when it mattered. I cut them loose before the trail turned south. One of the older warriors narrowed his eyes, stepping closer to study Ethan's face as if searching for cracks in a story that refused to stretch itself into something bigger than it was. And the men who took them? He asked, his voice measured, careful. Ethan met his gaze for the first time, not defiant, not submissive, just honest in a way that felt unfamiliar out here. They kept riding, he said, and left it at that. No pride, no claim, just the truth stripped down to its bare shape. And that was when Naeli stepped forward again, closer than before, close enough to see the small tremor in Ethan's hands where the rope held them. Not fear, but fatigue, the kind that settled into a man's bones after too many hours pushing against something that did not want to be moved. Her eyes drifted to his shirt again, to the darker patches that had dried into the fabric, and then to the horses, to the way one young stallion edged closer to him, lowering its head just enough to brush against his shoulder before being gently guided back by a warrior. The gesture was small, almost nothing, but it carried weight, because animals did not offer trust where it had not been earned. Naeli felt something shift inside her then, not enough to change the moment, but enough to loosen its grip, and she reached out, not to untie him, not yet, but to take hold of the rope between his wrists, testing it, measuring it, as if the answer she needed was not in his words or the tracks or even the horses, but in the way he stood there, bound and silent, while everything around him slowly began to speak on his behalf. The rope stayed in her hand longer than it needed to, not because she could not untie it, but because something in her was still deciding if she should, and Ethan felt that hesitation more than the pull of the rawhide against his wrists, the kind of pause that held weight, that asked a question without ever speaking it aloud. And around them the warriors shifted again, not tightening, not loosening, just waiting. Because whatever came next did not belong to force anymore. It belonged to her. Nayeli's fingers traced the length of the rope slowly, feeling the tension in it, the way it had been tied with care, not anger. And then her gaze lifted back to Ethan's face, searching not for fear, but for something harder to find, something that did not show itself easily in men who had learned to survive alone. "Why?" she asked, the word simple, but it carried more weight than any accusation before it. And Ethan let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his eyes drifting past her again, not to avoid her, but because some answers were easier to find in distance than in another person's gaze. "Because they were not mine," he said finally, the same words as before, but quieter now, as if he was not trying to convince her anymore, only stating something that had never needed explaining in his own mind. Nayeli studied him in silence, the answer not satisfying, but not empty either, and she stepped closer still, close enough now that the space between them no longer felt like a barrier, but something else entirely, something that carried tension of a different kind, not danger, not yet trust, but recognition beginning to take shape. She glanced once more at the horses, at the way they had begun to settle, their restless shifting easing into something calmer, as if the land itself was starting to accept what had been returned to it. One of the older warriors spoke then, his voice low, measured. "A man does not follow 200 horses for miles without reason." And though the words were directed toward her, his eyes remained on Ethan, searching, weighing. Nayeli did not answer him, not yet, because she was still watching Ethan's hands, still bound, still open, still empty, and slowly, almost without thinking, she loosened her grip on the rope, not enough to release him, but enough to change what it meant, no longer a hold of control, but something closer to a test. "You could have taken them," she said, her voice softer now, not accusing, but probing. "Sold them, vanished, no one would have known." Ethan let out a faint breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though it held no humor, only a kind of tired understanding. "I would have known," he said, and that was all. No explanation, no story attached to it, just a truth that stood on its own, and for a moment, that seemed to be enough. Nayeli's fingers tightened slightly again around the rope, but this time not to restrain, but to feel, to confirm something that had shifted in the air between them, something that no longer matched the image of a thief standing in their land. And behind her, one by one, the warriors began to lower their hands from their weapons, not as a command, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had changed, that the man in front of them was no longer just a stranger with stolen horses, but something more complicated, something that did not fit easily into the stories they had been told. And still, Nayeli did not untie him, not yet, because the question had changed, and she needed to know not just what he had done, but who he was when no one was watching, when there was nothing to gain and everything to walk away from. The wind shifted again, softer now, carrying the quiet sound of leather and breath as the horses began to settle into something deeper than rest, something like recognition, and Nayeli felt it before she understood it. The way the herd no longer stood as something returned, but something that had chosen to remain, and her eyes moved across them slowly until one detail pulled her forward, subtle, almost hidden beneath the dust and fading light. A young mare near the edge of the group lifted her head as Nayeli approached, not in alarm, but with a calm that felt deliberate, and there, just along her shoulder, the mark of careful stitching caught the last of the sun, not crude, not rushed, but precise in a way that spoke of patience, of hands that had taken time where time should not have been wasted. Nayeli stepped closer, raising her hand slowly, giving the animal space to pull away, but it did not. It held still, breathing steady as her fingers brushed lightly along the healed line. And in that moment, something shifted again, deeper this time, because this was not the work of a man chasing profit. This was the work of someone who had stopped when it would have been easier to keep moving, someone who had chosen care over distance. She straightened slowly, her gaze returning to Ethan, still standing where they had left him, still bound, still silent, and she walked back toward him without looking at the others. because she did not need their confirmation anymore. The truth was already standing in front of her. "You stopped for them," she said, not asking, and Ethan's eyes met hers, steady, without defense. "They would not have made it otherwise," he replied. And again, nothing more. No claim, no need for recognition. Just the plain weight of a choice already made. One of the younger warriors spoke from behind her, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. He could have left them. And the older one answered quietly, almost to himself. Most would have. The words settled into the space between them. And for a moment, no one moved. Because the shape of the story had changed, it no longer pointed toward theft or punishment, but toward something harder to measure, something that did not fit easily into the lines that separated them. Nayeli's hand tightened slightly around the rope once more, not out of doubt, but out of thought, because this was the part that mattered. Not what he had done when he was seen, but what he had chosen when no one was there to witness it. She stepped closer again, close enough now that the space between them carried warmth instead of distance, and slowly, deliberately, she began to loosen the knot at his wrists, not all at once, not quickly, but with care, as if the act itself needed to be understood by everyone watching. The rawhide gave way inch by inch, until finally, it slipped free, and Ethan's hands fell open at his sides, the marks left behind faint but present, a reminder of what had been assumed before the truth had time to arrive. He did not move right away, did not rub his wrists, did not step back. He simply stood there, the same as before, as if nothing had changed, and that, more than anything, settled the last of the doubt in Nayeli's mind. Because a man who had something to prove would have shown it then, would have filled the silence with words or movement, but Ethan did neither. And as the last light dipped lower across the valley, Nayeli realized that what stood before her was not a man asking to be believed, but one who had already done what was right long before anyone was there to see it. No one spoke when the rope fell away, but the silence was no longer heavy. It had changed into something steadier, something that held respect without announcing it, and Ethan felt it in the way the air moved, in the way the warriors no longer closed in around him, but stood where they were, giving him space not because they had to, but because they chose to, and still he did not step forward or back. He simply remained where he was, as if waiting for the land itself to decide what came next. Nayeli watched him closely, not as a threat anymore, not even as a stranger, but as something she had not yet named, something that did not fit inside the story she had grown up hearing, and that unsettled her more than anger ever could, because anger was simple, it gave direction, but this required her to look again, to question what she thought she understood. The sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the ground, and the horses shifted with it, settling into a calm that spread through the valley like quiet water. One by one, the warriors stepped back, not in retreat, but in recognition, their posture easing, their hands no longer hovering near weapons. And in that small movement, the moment changed again, not dramatic, not loud, just undeniable. Nayeli turned her gaze toward the herd once more, then back to Ethan, her voice softer now, carrying none of the edge it held before. "You should leave before night," she said. And the words were not a dismissal, not a warning, but something closer to concern, something that surprised even her as she spoke it. Ethan nodded once, slow, understanding the meaning beneath what was said, because night out here was not just darkness, it was distance, it was choice. And it was also the moment a man proved whether he stayed for something or walked away from it. He glanced once toward the horses, the herd that had never been his, and yet had followed him all this way, and then back toward the open land beyond the valley, the path he knew, the kind that did not ask questions, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he would take it, his body shifting just enough to suggest movement. But then he stopped, not because anyone told him to, not because he was expected to, but because something in him had not yet settled. Nayeli saw it, the hesitation that did not come from fear or uncertainty, but from something deeper, something that mirrored the same quiet conflict she felt within herself, and she stepped closer again, not to stop him, but to stand where he could not ignore her presence, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that carried new weight. "You followed them for miles," she said, her voice low, almost thoughtful now. "You stayed when you could have turned back." Ethan held her gaze, And for the first time, there was something different in it. Not guarded, not distant, but open in a way that did not come easily to men like him. Some things are not meant to be left behind, he replied, and the words settled between them, quiet, but heavy with meaning that reached further than the moment itself. Naeli felt it then, clear and undeniable, that whatever had begun in suspicion had crossed into something else entirely, something neither of them had planned. And as the last light slipped behind the hills, leaving only the soft glow of dusk across the land, she realized that letting him walk away would not return things to what they had been before, because something had already changed, not in the land, not in the herd, but in the space between them. And once something like that shifted, it did not simply disappear into the dark. The first stars began to show above the valley, faint at first, then sharper as the last trace of daylight slipped away, and still Ethan had not moved, not toward the open land behind him, not toward the herd that had already begun to drift back under the quiet guidance of the warriors. He simply stood there, caught in that narrow space between leaving and staying, a place most men avoided because it demanded more than instinct. It demanded choice. Naeli remained where she was, close enough. Now that the distance between them felt deliberate rather than uncertain, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that did not need filling, the kind that carried its own weight, until finally she broke it, not with authority, not with command, but with something softer, something that did not belong to the leader she had been raised to become. "You are not from here," she said, and it was not a question. Ethan gave a slight shake of his head, his eyes drifting toward the horizon again, though now it held less certainty than before. "No," he answered, his voice quieter than it had been, worn down by distance and something else he had not yet named. Naeli studied him, the way he stood, the way he seemed more at ease in silence than in explanation, and she understood something then, not about where he came from, but about what he carried, the kind of solitude that did not come from choice alone, but from things a man chose not to speak about. She turned slightly, glancing toward the warriors who had begun to lead the horses away in small groups, their movements steady, practiced, and then back to Ethan. "Most men who cross into this land come to take something," she said, her voice low, measured. "You brought something back." The words settled between them, not as praise, but as acknowledgement, and Ethan did not answer right away. He simply watched as the last of the horses moved past, their shapes fading into the growing dark, until only the sound of their movement remained, soft and distant. "It was never mine to keep," he said again. But this time the words carried something different, not just a statement, but a kind of finality, as if he had already decided something within himself. Naeli felt it, the shift, the way his posture changed just enough to signal that he was about to leave, and something in her resisted it, not loudly, not in a way she could name, but enough to make her step forward once more, closing the last of the space between them, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that had nothing to do with duty anymore. "And what do you take with you?" she asked, the question quiet, but it held more than curiosity. It held something that had been building since the moment he arrived, something neither of them had spoken aloud. Ethan looked at her then, really looked, not past her, not through her, but at her, and for a brief moment, the distance he carried seemed to falter, just enough to reveal something underneath, something honest and unguarded. "Nothing," he said, but the word did not feel complete, not to her, not to him, and they both knew it, because there are moments when a man leaves something behind without meaning to, and moments when he takes something with him without realizing it, and this felt like both at once, the kind of moment that did not belong to either of them fully, but had settled between them all the same. The wind moved softly through the valley, carrying the scent of dust and night, and in that quiet, something unspoken held them there, balanced on the edge of a choice neither had yet made. The night settled fully over the valley, wrapping everything in a quiet that felt almost deliberate, as if the land itself was listening, waiting to see what would be said next, and Ethan could feel it in the stillness around him, the kind that did not come from emptiness, but from presence, from something unseen holding the moment in place. Naeli did not step back, did not turn away. She stayed where she was, close enough that he could hear the steady rhythm of her breathing, calm, controlled, but carrying something beneath it that had not been there before. something that had nothing to do with suspicion or judgment. Her eyes held his without hesitation now, not searching, not questioning, but seeing, and that changed everything. Because to be seen out here, truly seen, was something a man did not come across often, not without cost. The wind moved lightly between them, lifting a strand of her dark hair across her face, and she did not brush it away, did not break the moment for something so small. Instead she spoke, her voice low, steady, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "You gave back what was ours," she said, not as a statement of fact, but as something deeper, something that reached beyond the herd and into the space between them. Ethan did not answer, not because he did not have words, but because he understood that this moment was not asking for them. It was asking for something else, something quieter, something that could not be shaped by explanation. Nayeli took one more step forward, closing the last inch of distance between them, and for a moment, neither moved, neither breathed any differently. The world narrowing down to that single point where two paths had crossed and refused to separate again. Her hand lifted slowly, not in hesitation, but with intention, and came to rest lightly against his chest, over the place where the dust and the long miles had settled into him, where the quiet strength he carried had been built, piece by piece without anyone there to witness it. And in that touch, there was no claim, no demand, only recognition, the kind that did not ask permission because it did not need it. Ethan felt it, the weight of it, the truth of it. And for the first time since he had ridden into that valley, something in him shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would see, but inside, where the distance he had carried for so long had begun to loosen, just enough to let something else in. Nayeli leaned closer then, her voice dropping to something softer than the wind itself, meant only for him, for that narrow space between them where no one else could reach. "You returned what was taken," she whispered, the words slow, deliberate, carrying more meaning than their shape suggested, and then she paused, just long enough for the moment to settle, for the weight of it to be felt fully, before finishing. "So now I give what is mine." The words did not rise, did not echo, but they stayed. They settled into the air between them and refused to leave, and Ethan did not move, did not step back, did not question what had just been placed before him. Because some things out here were not meant to be explained, they were meant to be accepted, or walked away from. And in the quiet that followed, with the stars above and the land stretched wide around them, it became clear that whatever choice he made next would not belong to the road behind him, but to something entirely new that had just begun. The words did not echo, they did not need to. They settled into Ethan the way dust settles after a long ride, quiet but impossible to ignore, and for a moment he said nothing, did nothing, because some choices out here were not made with words, they were made with stillness, with the way a man chose to remain or turn away, and the valley seemed to hold its breath with him, the stars stretching wide above, the land open and silent as if it had seen this moment before in another time, another life. Nayeli did not move her hand from his chest, did not take back what she had given, because she understood what it meant, not ownership, not possession, but something older, something tied to honor and balance, the kind that could not be broken without consequence. And behind her, the warriors had stopped completely now, their movements stilled, their voices gone, each of them watching not as judges, but as witnesses to something they all recognized, even if none of them spoke it aloud. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that came from deep inside, where a man kept the parts of himself he did not show the world, and he looked at her again, not as someone passing through, not as someone standing apart, but as someone standing within the moment itself. And that was the difference. That was where everything changed, because before this, he had always been moving, always leaving before anything had the chance to take hold. But now, the road behind him felt distant, smaller than it had any right to be, and the land in front of him, this land, felt different, not familiar, but not used to, something in between, something that did not ask him to prove anything, only to choose. Nayeli saw it in his eyes, the shift that did not need explanation, and, slowly, she lowered her hand, not because the moment had ended, but because it had already done what it needed to do, and she stepped back just enough to give him space again, not distance, but room to stand on his own decision. The wind moved lightly across the valley, carrying the faint sound of the horses now settled somewhere beyond sight. And in that quiet, Ethan finally moved, not toward the open land he had come from, not toward the path that would take him back to the life he knew, but forward, one small step, not enough to declare anything, but enough to say he was not walking away. And that was all it took. Naeli did not smile, did not speak, but something in her posture eased, something that had been held tight since the moment he arrived finally letting go, and behind her, one by one, the warriors lowered their heads, not deeply, not ceremonially, just enough to acknowledge what had been decided without words. Because out here, respect was not given loudly, it was given in silence, in the way a man was allowed to stand among them without being questioned. Ethan stood there, feeling it, not as something granted, but as something earned in a way he had not expected. And the night closed in around them, steady, calm, carrying no more tension, only the quiet understanding that had settled into the space between them. And somewhere in that stillness, it became clear that the story had never been about the horses, or the distance, or even the misunderstanding that brought him there. It had been about the moment a man chose not to take what he could, but to return what was not his, and in doing so, found something he had not been looking for, something that did not belong to the road, but to the place he now stood, and the people who had seen him for what he truly was, not by his words, not by where he came from, but by the choices he made when no one was there to see them. He thought the cold would be the worst thing he faced that night. He was wrong. The wind clawed at Ethan Cole's cabin like it wanted inside, slipping through the cracks, carrying the kind of chill that settled deep in a man's bones and stayed there. He sat by the fire, boots still on, hat low over his eyes, listening to the quiet the way a man listens for trouble. Out here, quiet didn't mean peace. It meant waiting. The kettle whispered on the iron stove. Wood popped in the flames. Everything else held its breath. Then came the sound. Not loud, not urgent, just a soft scrape against the door. Ethan didn't move at first. He had learned that lesson years ago. Some sounds weren't meant to be answered. But it came again, slower this time, like something, or someone, running out of strength. He stood, the floorboards creaking under his weight, and reached for the handle without thinking. The moment his hand touched the cold iron latch, something inside him hesitated. Not fear, recognition. Like a memory he didn't want to remember. He opened the door anyway. The wind rushed in first, sharp and bitter, carrying snow that stung his face. And there she was, half collapsed against the frame, barely standing. The Apache woman's dark hair was tangled with frost, her clothes stiff with ice, her breathing shallow like each breath had to fight its way out. She didn't look at him right away, just stood there, swaying, like the storm had hollowed her out. Ethan's jaw tightened. He could have closed the door. Plenty of men would have told themselves it wasn't their fight. But he didn't. Get inside, he said, voice low, steady. She lifted her eyes then. Not grateful, not afraid, just watching him, measuring something he couldn't see. For a second, neither of them moved. Then she stepped forward, slow, careful, like crossing that threshold meant more than warmth. The firelight caught her face as she passed him. Dust, smoke, and something older. Something that didn't belong to this storm. Ethan shut the door behind her, cutting off the wind, but the cold didn't leave. It lingered. In the walls. In the air. In the silence between them. She didn't speak. Didn't ask. Just stood near the fire, hands close to the heat, eyes flicking once toward him, then away. Like she already knew him. That bothered him more than anything. He poured water into a tin cup, set it on the table. Sit, he said. She didn't. Not at first. Instead, her gaze drifted across the cabin, slow, deliberate, taking in the rifle above the door, the worn saddle by the wall, the old coat hanging near the bed. Then it stopped. On him. Ethan felt it. That look. Not fear. Not suspicion. Something heavier. Like judgment carried a long way. He turned slightly, just enough to break it. Storm'll last till morning, he muttered. You're safe here. The words settled between them. Simple. Final. But she didn't nod. Didn't thank him. She just stepped closer to the fire, and for the first time, Ethan realized something that made his chest tighten. She wasn't cold anymore. She was waiting. The words did not echo, but they settled deep, like something placed carefully where it could not be ignored. and Ethan Cole felt the weight of them press against the quiet he had built for himself over the years. He did not move right away, did not look at her. His eyes stayed on the strip of fabric pinned to the wall, worn thin at the edges, its color long faded into something between brown and memory. "You do not know what you are talking about," he said, but the words lacked the edge they should have carried. She stepped closer, not threatening, not cautious, just certain, like every step had already been decided before she ever reached his door. "I know where it came from," she said. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he realizes the past has found its way back without asking permission. Outside, the wind shifted, pushing snow against the cabin in long, whispering waves. Inside, the fire dimmed slightly, as if even it was listening. "That was a long time ago," he said. "Things change." She shook her head once. "Not what is carried," she replied. "Simple. Final." Ethan finally turned to face her fully, his eyes narrowing just enough to study her in a different way now, not as a stranger in need, but as someone who had crossed miles of frozen ground with purpose. "Then, say it," he said quietly. "Say what you think you know." For a moment, she did not answer. Her gaze moved past him, resting briefly on the door, then the window, measuring distance, space, something unseen. Then back to him. "You were there," she said. Not a question. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. He could not. Silence stretched between them, thick and unbroken, until even the sound of the fire seemed distant. "A long time ago," he repeated, softer now, like the words might make it smaller than it was. She stepped closer to the wall and reached out, her fingers hovering just above the fabric without touching it. "Someone tried to stop it," she said. "Someone stood between." Ethan felt something shift in his chest, sharp and unexpected, like a memory refusing to stay buried. A voice. A moment. A choice made too late or too soon. He had never decided which. "That is not how I remember it," he said. She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time there was something in her expression that was not just certainty. It was something deeper. "Older. That is because you walked away," she said. The words did not accuse. They did not need to. Ethan looked down at his hands, rough, steady, unchanged, and yet they felt unfamiliar in that moment. "Everyone walked away," he said, but even as he spoke, he knew it was not true. She lowered her hand, letting it fall back to her side. "Not everyone," she said. Another silence followed, but this one was different. It was no longer empty. It carried meaning, waiting to be understood. Ethan lifted his gaze again, searching her face, the lines of it, the calm that did not belong to someone who had simply survived a storm. "Why are you here?" he asked. This time, she did not hesitate. "Because you did not finish what you started," she said. The words landed heavier than anything before them, and for the first time that night, Ethan felt something colder than the wind outside. Not fear. Not yet. Something closer to realization. His eyes flicked once toward the rifle above the door, then back to her. He still did not reach for it. "And what do you think that was?" he asked. She held his gaze, steady as the mountains beyond the storm. "You chose once," she said. "Now you choose again." The choice did not come with noise or motion. It came the way most things that matter do, quiet and waiting, and Ethan Cole felt it settle between them like a line drawn in the dust that could not be unseen. He did not answer her right away. Instead, he walked past her slowly, boots heavy against the wooden floor, until he stood near the door. The cold seeped through the cracks, brushing against his skin, reminding him that the world outside had not stopped while he stood here, facing what he had tried to forget. "You came a long way to say that," he said, his voice even, but there was something beneath it now, something less certain. She did not follow him. She stayed where she was, near the wall, near the piece of fabric that had started all of this again. "I came because you would not," she replied. Ethan let out a breath that fogged faintly in the dim light, his hand resting near the doorframe, but not touching it. He could feel the weight of the rifle above him without looking, could feel the years between then and now pressing in, asking him if they had meant anything at all. "You think I owe you something," he said. "I think you owe yourself," she answered. The words landed differently, not sharp, not accusing, just true in a way that did not leave room for argument. Ethan turned back toward her, slower this time, his eyes searching her face for something he could push against, something that would make this easier to dismiss. He did not find it. "If someone followed you," he said, shifting the moment. They will not stop at my door. She nodded once, like she had already considered that. They will not need to, she said. They already know where you stand. That made his jaw tighten. I do not stand anywhere, he said. That is the problem, she replied. Silence again. But this time it carried a kind of pressure, like the air before a storm breaks, even though the storm outside had not yet passed. Ethan moved to the small window, wiping a thin line through the frost with the side of his hand. The night beyond was a blur of white and shadow, the wind still moving, still restless. But there was something else now. Something still. Something watching. He narrowed his eyes, leaning closer, his breath fogging the glass. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then a shape shifted at the edge of the storm. Not close. Not yet. But there. He stepped back from the window, slow, deliberate, his mind already moving ahead of him. You said someone followed, he murmured. She walked toward him then, her steps quiet, controlled, stopping just short of the light spilling from the fire. Not someone, she said. More than one. Ethan nodded once, like that confirmed something he had already known before she said it. His eyes flicked toward the rifle above the door again, then back to her. Still, he did not reach for it. Not yet. You brought them here, he said. She did not deny it. I brought truth here, she answered. He almost laughed, but it did not come out. Instead, he shook his head slightly, the corners of his mouth tightening. Truth does not knock on a man's door in the middle of a storm, he said. It waits, she replied, until he has nowhere left to run. The fire cracked behind them, louder now, as if the cabin itself could feel the shift. Ethan took a step toward the center of the room, away from the door, away from the window, placing himself where both could be seen without turning his back. If they come through that door, he said slowly, they will expect something. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. So will I. The words settled, final, and for the first time that night, Ethan understood what she had meant when she said he would choose again. It was not about the past. It was about what he would do when it walked through his door this time. The wind did not knock. It pressed, slow and steady, like it already knew the door would open sooner or later, and Ethan Cole stood in the center of the cabin feeling the weight of that pressure settle into his bones. He did not move toward the rifle. He did not move toward the door. He just stood there, listening, the way a man listens when he knows the next sound will matter. Outside, the storm shifted again, the howl softening into something quieter, something more deliberate, and that was what made his eyes narrow. Storms did not quiet like that unless something else was moving through them. Nayeli did not look at the window this time. She watched him. Not the door. Not the rifle. Him. Like whatever came next had already been decided by what he chose to do before it even arrived. How many? He asked, his voice low, controlled. She did not hesitate. Enough, she said. Ethan gave a small nod, like that was answer enough. Numbers did not matter out here. What mattered was intent. He walked slowly toward the table, his fingers brushing the edge of it, grounding himself in something solid while his thoughts moved ahead. They come for you, he said. Or for me. For what was left unfinished, she replied. The words settled between them again, heavy and certain, and Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not fear, not yet, but awareness, like a door opening in a place he had kept closed for years. He stopped near the fire, the heat brushing against his side, and glanced once more at the rifle above the door. His hand lifted slightly, then stopped. Not yet. He let it fall back to his side. Nayeli saw it. Said nothing. That silence spoke louder than any warning. Outside, a shape moved closer to the cabin, just at the edge of sight. Then another, shadows cutting through the white like they belonged there. No rush. No noise. Just presence. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath steady now, his posture changing in a way that was almost imperceptible, but real. Less uncertain. More decided. You knew this would happen, he said. She inclined her head slightly. Yes. And you came anyway. Yes. He studied her for a long second, searching for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that would make this simpler. There was none. Only that same quiet certainty. Then you are not here for shelter, he said. No, she answered. I am here for truth. Ethan almost smiled at that, but it did not reach his eyes. Truth has a way of costing more than a man plans to pay, he said. She took a step closer, stopping just within the edge of the firelight, her face calm, her gaze unwavering. You already paid once, she said. You just did not stay to see what it meant. The words struck deeper this time, not because they were louder, but because they were closer to something he had tried not to name. Ethan turned his head slightly, looking again toward the fabric on the wall, the one piece he had kept without ever explaining why. I remember enough, he said quietly. No, she replied. You remember what let you leave. Silence again, but this time it carried something sharper, something that pressed against the edges of his patience, his control. Outside, the shapes stopped moving, just beyond the reach of the light from the window. Waiting. Ethan felt it. That stillness. That expectation. He stepped toward the door now, slow, deliberate, each movement chosen. His hand lifted again, this time not toward the rifle, but toward the latch. He paused there, fingers hovering just short of it. Behind him, Nayeli did not move, did not speak. She did not need to. The choice was here now. Not later. Not tomorrow. Now. Ethan closed his eyes for the briefest second, just long enough to feel the weight of the past settle into the present. Then he opened them again, steady, clear. When this door opens, he said, his voice low but firm, it does not close the same way. Nayeli's answer came just as quietly. That depends on the man who opens it. The wind pressed once more against the wood, softer now, like it was no longer trying to get in, like it was waiting to be let in. Ethan's hand tightened slightly, and then he made his choice. The latch turned with a sound too small to carry the weight of what it meant, and Ethan Cole pulled the door open into the cold without reaching for the rifle above him, without looking back, without giving himself the chance to hesitate again. The wind did not rush in this time. It eased past him, quiet, controlled, like it had been waiting for permission. Snow drifted low across the ground, thin sheets moving over the frozen earth, and beyond it stood the shapes he had seen before, clearer now, still as stone, watching. Not close enough to threaten, not far enough to ignore. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, boots settling into a thin layer of snow that had already begun to harden under. The night air. He did not close the door behind him. He did not need to. The warmth inside stayed where it was. The cold stayed where it belonged. For a moment, nothing moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant whisper of wind across open land, the kind of sound that carried no message unless a man chose to hear one. Ethan let his gaze travel across them, counting without counting, feeling the quiet discipline in the way they stood, in the way they did not advance, did not call out, did not reach for anything that would force his hand. They were not here to take something. They were here to see what he would give. That realization settled deep, heavier than anything said inside the cabin. He took one step forward off the porch, then another, stopping where the light from the open door behind him faded into shadow. Close enough to be seen clearly, far enough that the cabin no longer felt like a shield. His hands hung at his sides, open, empty. He kept them there. From behind him, he could feel Nayeli's presence in the doorway, silent, steady, like a line between two worlds that had never quite touched until now. The figures in the distance shifted slightly, not forward, not back, just enough to show they were aware, measuring him the same way he measured them. Then one step forward. Not fast, not slow, just certain. The man who moved carried no visible threat, no raised voice, no demand. Only presence. He stopped several yards away, close enough that Ethan could see the lines of his face, the calm in his eyes, the weight of years carried without display. They stood there, facing each other across that narrow space, the cold air between them sharp and clean. Ethan did not speak. He waited. The man inclined his head slightly, not in submission, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement, as if something had already been understood before either of them arrived. Then his gaze moved, briefly, to Ethan's empty hands, then back to his face. That was all. No words. No challenge. Just a question without sound. Ethan felt it. That question. It did not ask what he had done. It asked what he would do now. Behind him, the fire inside the cabin cracked softly, the sound carrying out into the night, faint but steady, a reminder of something warmer, something human, something that could be lost or kept depending on the next breath. Ethan drew that breath slowly, letting it fill his chest, letting it settle the last of the noise inside him. He did not look back. He did not reach for anything. He simply took one more step forward, closing the distance just enough to make his answer clear without speaking it. The man watched him, still, unreadable. Then after a moment that stretched long enough to matter, he gave a single nod. It was small, almost nothing, but it carried more weight than any threat ever could. Around them, the others shifted again, not advancing, not retreating, just releasing something unseen. The tension did not break. It changed. Ethan stood there, the cold pressing against his coat, the silence holding steady, and for the first time since the door had opened, he understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of what came after a man chose differently. The nod should have ended it, but it did not, because some moments do not close, they open, and Ethan Cole felt that shift settle around him like the cold air itself had changed shape. The man in front of him stepped back, not in retreat, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement, creating space where there had been tension only seconds before. The others followed without a word, their movements quiet, deliberate, as if guided by something unspoken that Ethan was only beginning to understand. No one reached for anything. No one raised a voice. And yet, everything had been said. Ethan stood where he was, boots firm in the snow, his breath steady, his hands still at his sides, feeling the weight of what had just passed without a single word spoken aloud. Behind him, the cabin door remained open, a line of warm light stretching across the frozen ground, touching the edges of the night without pushing it back. Nayeli stepped out then, her presence joining his in the cold, her gaze moving from him to the figures now easing into the storm's edge. She did not call out. She did not signal. She simply watched, the same way she had watched him. Inside, measuring, confirming, closing something that had been left unfinished. "It is done," she said quietly. Ethan did not turn to her right away. His eyes remained on the last of the figures as they faded into the shifting white, their shapes dissolving into the storm until there was nothing left but wind and distance. "No," he said after a moment, his voice low, thoughtful. "Not done." Nayeli looked at him, not questioning, not correcting, just waiting. Ethan finally turned then, facing her fully, the light from the cabin catching the edge of his face, the lines there deeper than before, not from age, but from something settling into place. "They did not come for revenge," he said. "They came for an answer." She inclined her head slightly. "Yes. And I gave it," he continued. "You did," she replied. Silence stretched again, but this time it did not press. It settled, like something that had found where it belonged. Ethan glanced once more toward the empty space where the figures had stood, then back at her. "You knew that would be enough," he said. "I knew it had to be," she answered. He studied her for a long second, the weight of her words from earlier returning, the truth she had carried into his cabin now standing between them, no longer sharp, no longer distant, just real. "You could have said it inside," he said. "You could have told me what they wanted." Nayeli shook her head once. "You would have heard it," she said, "but you would not have chosen it." Ethan let out a slow breath, the faintest hint of something like understanding crossing his expression. "So you brought them here," he said. "So I could not look away." "Yes." The wind picked up again, stronger now, as if the storm had decided its waiting was over, snow sweeping across the ground in long, shifting lines that blurred the tracks already fading behind those who had left. Ethan looked down briefly, watching those marks disappear, erased by time, and weather the same way so many things had been before. Then he looked back up at her. "And now?" he asked. Nayeli's gaze softened, just slightly, not in kindness, not in relief, but in something quieter, something that did not need a name. "Now, you remember correctly," she said. The words settled differently than before, not as a challenge, not as a weight, as a truth that had finally found its place. Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate, then turned toward the cabin, stepping back into the warmth without hesitation this time. He left the door open a moment longer, letting the cold linger at the threshold, then reached out and closed it, the sound soft, final, not as a barrier, but as a choice made and accepted. Behind him, the fire burned steady, unchanged, and for the first time in years, the silence inside did not feel like something he had built to hide in. It felt like something he had earned. The door closed with a soft weight that lingered longer than the sound itself, and Ethan Cole stood just inside the cabin, feeling the warmth settle around him in a way it never had before, not because the fire burned any different, but because something inside him no longer resisted it. The wind continued outside, moving across the land with steady purpose, but it no longer pressed against the walls like before. It passed, like it had nothing left to prove. Ethan walked slowly toward the center of the room, his boots leaving faint marks on the wooden floor where melted snow began to fade almost as quickly as it appeared. He did not look at the rifle. He did not need to. His attention moved instead to the wall, to the strip of fabric that had remained untouched for years, waiting without asking to be remembered. Nayeli entered behind him without a sound, closing the distance between outside and inside as easily as she had crossed the storm itself. She stopped near the fire again, but this time her posture was different. Not guarded, not measuring, simply present. Ethan reached up slowly, his hand pausing just before the fabric, fingers hovering like he was not certain he had the right to touch it again. "You said someone stood between," he said quietly, "that they did not walk away." Nayeli did not move, but her voice carried clearly through the stillness. "She did not," she said. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, and when he opened them, the memory did not come as fragments this time. It came whole. Not louder, not sharper, just clearer. A moment where the noise had stopped for him alone. A choice that had not belonged to anyone else. "I remember now," he said. Not as a defense, not as an excuse, just as truth. He took the fabric down from the wall, holding it in both hands, feeling its weight, light as it was, settle deeper than anything he had carried before. "It was not mine to keep," he added. Nayeli stepped closer, her gaze soft but steady, not reaching for the fabric, not claiming it, just witnessing what he would do with it now that he understood. "No," she said, "but it was yours to return." Ethan looked at her, really looked this time, not searching, not questioning, just seeing. "And now?" he asked. Nayeli's eyes shifted briefly toward the door, toward the world beyond it, then back to him. "Now you decide what comes after remembering," she said. The fire crackled low, steady, the sound filling the space between them without breaking it. Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate, then moved to the table, setting the fabric down carefully, not as something to be hidden again, but as something placed where it could be seen. He reached for his coat, pulling it on with practiced motion, the weight of it settling across his shoulders like something familiar, something chosen. Nayeli watched him, not surprised, not questioning. "You are leaving," she said. "I am returning," he replied. The distinction hung there, quiet but clear. He walked toward the door again, stopping just before it, his hand resting against the wood, feeling the cold on the other side without opening it yet. "You came here to make me see," he said. "I did," she answered. "But you stayed," he added, glancing back at her. Nayeli held his gaze, calm, certain. "Because seeing is not enough," she said. Ethan nodded once more, then opened the door again, the cold greeting him without resistance this time, the storm already moving on, leaving behind a land that looked the same, but was not. He stepped out, not looking back, not hesitating, carrying nothing but what he had finally chosen to keep, and behind him, Nayeli remained by the fire, not following, not calling out, because some paths were not meant to be walked together, only understood in the same moment. The cold did not bite the same way as before. It settled, steady and honest, and Ethan Cole walked into it without pulling his coat tighter, his boots pressing fresh tracks into snow that had not yet decided whether to remember him or let him pass. The storm had moved on, leaving the sky low and gray, the kind of morning that did not promise anything, only space for a man to decide what he would carry into it. He did not look back at the cabin. He did not need to. The fire, the walls, the years he had spent inside them had already been left where they belonged. Ahead, the land stretched open, quiet, but no longer empty. Every step felt different, not lighter, not easier, just true. Behind him, inside the cabin, Nayeli stood where he had left her, the fire casting a steady glow against the walls, the fabric still resting on the table where he had placed it, no longer hidden, no longer waiting. She moved toward it slowly, her fingers brushing the worn edge, not taking it, not claiming it, just acknowledging what it had become. Outside, the sound of Ethan's steps faded into distance, each one carrying him further from the man who had once walked away and closer to the one who now returned. He followed no trail he could see, only the one he remembered, the one he had tried to forget but could not. The land did not guide him. It did not need to. Memory did. The kind that did not change with time, only with truth. Hours passed without measure, the light shifting just enough to mark them, and still he walked, steady, deliberate, until the shape of something familiar began to rise against the horizon. Not a town, not a place of walls and noise. Something quieter. Something that had been left behind not because it was gone, but because it had been too heavy to carry. Ethan slowed as he approached, his steps no longer driven by distance, but by understanding. He stopped a few yards short, the wind moving lightly across the ground, brushing against him without resistance. For a long moment, he said nothing, did nothing, just stood there, facing what remained, not as a stranger, not as a man passing through, but as someone who had finally come back to where his choice had begun. He reached into his coat slowly, pulling out the small piece he had taken from the table before leaving, not to keep, not to hide, but to return. He held it in his hand, looking at it once more, not as a burden, not as a reminder of something he wished undone, but as proof of something he had chosen differently now. He knelt, placing it down carefully, not marking the moment with words, not asking for anything in return, just setting it where it belonged. The wind shifted slightly, lifting a faint trace of snow across it, not covering it, not erasing it, just letting it rest where it could be found again if it needed to be. Ethan stood after a moment, his gaze steady, his shoulders no longer carrying what they once had. He did not stay. He did not need to. The past did not ask for that. It only asked to be faced. He turned then, not toward the cabin, not toward any place he had known before, but toward the open land beyond, where nothing waited except what he would choose next. Back at the cabin, Nayeli stood at the doorway now, the wind moving gently around her, the fire behind her steady, unchanged. She looked out across the distance where he had gone, her expression calm, unreadable, but not empty. After a moment, she stepped back inside and closed the door, the sound soft, final, not as an ending, but as a quiet understanding that some debts are not paid in words, and some justice does not arrive with force, only with a man willing to stand still long enough to choose who he becomes when no one is watching.